right, hopefully you can see my screen. Yeah, so I am Sierra. Thank you for the nice introduction. I do work in Chris's group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I'm here to talk about the linked data modeling language, or LinkML for short. And even though you gave me a very nice introduction, hold on one second. It looks like I'm having Zoom trouble, of course. 1 second here. Let me reshare this. All right, we're just going to go with the old school way of doing this presentation. That wasn't working. Okay, so even though you gave me a nice introduction, thank you for that. I wanted to tell you a little bit more about myself to get started. I am a staff software developer in Chris Mungel's group. Before that, I joined about 2 years ago. I was the data architect for the Alliance of Genome Resources and a database administrator and software developer for the Zebrafish Information Network. And while at ZFIN, I had the pleasure of working on the Intermine project as well for that group. And while at Chris's group, I've had a nice opportunity to work on the technical architecture and infrastructure for the Gene Ontology project, for the Monarch Initiative, and for a group called the NCATS Data Translator, sponsored by the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. And, over the course of this experience, I've, had the pleasure of working on data integration in many different forms. So for the Alliance of Genome Resources, our task was really to bring together data from, all of these model organism databases that have existed for sometimes decades with their own data models and their own technical architecture. And the goal here is really to start using shared ingest pipelines. That's, if you're going to bring in NCBI gene data for one mod, you could probably bring them in for all of the different model organisms. You might want to, we want to, integrate our display interfaces and really try to provide data for all the model organisms in a single API and a single set of download files. So to make it easier for our users to integrate our data. And for the NCATS Data Translator project, we don't have the technical requirement to merge all of these resources together. Instead, we find that a federated approach would be beneficial. So, but we do have many data sources. We have over 300 in NCATS Data Translator at the moment. And our task there is to sort of encompass all biology from small molecules through clinical entities. And we really want to be able to answer translational questions that get to the root of either alternative treatments for disease or drug repurposing, for example, or the mechanism action of a particular drug, or any other kind of clinical questions that a researcher might have that isn't elucidated yet with tools in their different silos across our domain. And of course, I'm sure you're all very familiar with Monarch. We're trying to bring together data from a variety of sources and organisms to sort of make new insights into treating and identifying disease in human. And what we've found is that data integration is always a constant challenge. We know that there are insights here in this sort of amorphous cloud between one database resource and another database resources, but there are things that get in our way when we try to, integrate data and ask questions that are cross source. And I've listed a few of them. I'm sure all of you have had plenty of experience dealing with data in unfair formats, and fair is that term that we use: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But I've just listed a few of them. One of the major ones that we deal with all the time is identifier mapping. So if one resource uses an NCBI gene identifier to identify its genes, and another one generates its own identifier, how do you make sure that those two resources can talk to each other when really they're talking about the same genomic element? The basics of data structure naming. One database resource might call something an allele, and some other one might call it a variant. And the documentation of how to get that data from both of those resources is oftentimes in a variety of different formats, right? And you have to kind of go searching to figure out what that resource is defining their data objects by and how. And then we have the extra layer of different technologies providing different formats of data. So one resource might provide an OWL file, and another resource might provide a Postgres database dump. And we had a resource lately just provide C++ files and without instructions on how to compile those down. So we worked on that together to try to figure out how to get access to that data. And even when we do have really good data from a source, a rich curated data source, for example, sometimes the standards around the vocabularies they use or the data dictionaries or, whatever they use to define their data structures aren't machine actionable. So this is an example that Chris often uses from a project he works on where, this is sort of an extreme example, but you could see that if your standard is in PDF form or Excel, it's not very machine actionable. You really don't have access to validators, and there's unclear semantics about what that data is actually representing. So what turns out from that, or what this results in, is kind of a noisy data set. You might have anything from what looks to me like maybe a gene name or something here to a 0 water depth, a comma separated list of meter values, a decimal point here, excuse me. And so what we have is really messy data. So we see that. We also see that we have a lot of different standards, ontologies, and even just basic data from a lot of different reputable, really great sources. We have, all of these different basic genetic entities and substances. We have over 1,800 databases. As you look at fairsharing.org and just sort of count them up, we have 1,500 standards or more. And we've done a really good job with ontologies, but now we have over 900 of them. And Bioportal reports, 13.5 million terms. So when you're a user of these data sources, you have a lot to go on, but also you have a lot to go on. There's a lot of standards out there. And so what we find when we're integrating data is that, sometimes these standards are still not well understood or used correctly. So you might have one database communicating ontology annotations and another just unsure of which ontology to use and sort of developing their own, or looking at an ontology and finding that it's 80% complete, but that extra 20% prevents them from using it. So we still have oftentimes an experience where two resources that are talking about the same sort of data don't use the same ontologies. But if we have that, that's great. We can actually reuse a lot of the data between two sources if they are using the same ontologies or common vocabularies. You can look at the Gene Ontology Project and see that a wide variety of sources use this common ontology, and we can actually do a lot of cool things, enrichment studies, et cetera, with gene ontology annotations. But what we found over the course of our work is that those annotations aren't enough. Anytime you want metadata about the annotations made with a particular ontology, you're back to looking at incompatible schemas, usually from different resources. These have the square shaped schema and these have the round shaped schema, round and corner shaped schema, but really that could be a Postgres database, that could be an OWL file, whatever it is, those are incompatible. And really the common situation is that we have both problems. We have incompatible schemas and we have sometimes ontologies that are used incompletely or in different ways between resources. And so to solve this problem, Chris sort of looked at existing efforts that have been really successful. And one of those that he's very involved in and we're very involved in is the Open Biological Ontologies group, or the OBO Foundry. And the idea here was to provide a socio-technological and technical framework for cooperation. So you then, recruit the experts from their domains, let them work on a tiny piece of the puzzle and provide technical tools and infrastructure to allow them to put those together into something that lets us curate all the things. And we've been really successful at that. You can look at, again, the statistics. There's lots of ontologies. People are really capturing knowledge that way very successfully. About the same time as open biological ontologies were being, the OBO Foundry was being generated, we also started hearing more about the Semantic Web, which gave us a nice framework for identifying the pieces that contribute to data integration challenges and giving them names and asking people to format them in a way that's reusable. So we were introduced to URIs for identity and properties and classes, which I'll get into in a few more slides. And we had schemas that were very reusable, as well as rule languages and shape languages like Shex and Shackle that provided some validation on top of the sort of open world concept of a semantic web building block. And as I was mentioning, you can really do a lot with ontology annotations. You can use them for machine reasoning and discovery. You can do enrichment analysis over the course of a data set annotated with ontologies. And text mining has become a big use case of our ontology annotations. You can go through, lots of tools are available now that you can go through text and kind of identify the terms in that text that map to ontology terms as well. And, just the very basic use case of an ontology, if you have two different experiments, this is an example from the ENCODE project, two different examples of experiments with specifically annotated ontology terms, you can kind of walk up the ontology class hierarchy and find, similar terms that are the parents of these two experiments. And in that way, kind of letting somebody, for example, very simply search for hormone and get back to experiments that are annotated to completely different terms. So that's all well and good. I think when you try to apply this situation to the real world of data integration, this is probably my favorite slide in the whole deck, because I think a lot of us find ourselves right here in this middle of the, the Bermuda Triangle of languages that you need to deal with when you're talking about integrating data. So, and of course, like it's just a cartoon. Often many of us wear lots of these hats, right? And so we kind of fit into many of these buckets. But if you start sort of at the bottom here, you have clinicians and scientists speaking in Google Docs or Excel or web portals, talking to data scientists that are, very versed in pandas or scikit-learn or Spark or Bigtable. And you have our developers over here that are, having the Java versus Python debates and protobuf, GraphQL, SQL, Mongo, JSON schema has been really, popular. And you have your semantic web developers that are speaking RDF and Sparkle or Shackle or Shex. And so this is, I think Chris's group's favorite cartoon. Gosh, can't we just like make some progress here? Can't we have a universal framework? And people always bring up the XKCD comic. Well, you had 14 competing standards. It's ridiculous. We need to develop one universal standards. And at the end of the day, now you have 15 competing standards. But I think we can do better here. I mean, honestly, if you have the right group of experts getting together to make a model, I think you can really make progress in reducing the proliferation of standards and agreeing on conventions. And in fact, I think that's what this group does with variants and alleles, for example. You kind of come together and figure out a framework that works for everyone. And that's the purpose of the Alliance as well, is to sort of like determine, standards around how you talk about model organism data, et cetera. And another part of LinkML, which I'll get to now, is that it really tries to reuse these existing frameworks. It tries to parasitize, that's another way of looking at it, the existing frameworks that exist and give you the right tool for the right job. So here are the basics of LinkML. Right now, you have a meta model for structuring your data, and you have a tool set that is extremely important when you're talking about a model, because it allows you to interoperate across all of these different serializations in fairly robust command line ways. And I'll show you all the different ways you can interact with the LinkML model as we go on here. But just to talk a little bit about the metadata model, at the root of it are classes and slots. If you're talking about a different serialization, like a Postgres serialization of LinkML, you'd be talking about tables and columns. If you were talking about a JSON schema representation of LinkML, you'd be talking about classes and properties. But LinkML at its heart uses classes and slots. Those all have a definition and fit within a schema. And all of these four components are called elements. So really what we focus on is classes and slots. All these tools go along with that very simple representation of what you can include in your model. So along with the meta model come tools. We have validators that help you with ingest and output into a LinkML model. We have data converters that allow you to translate between, for example, a YAML file and a JSON schema file, or a TSV file and a Neo4j database. We have lots of those compatibility tools, and we allow you to work with LinkML in OWL format as well, so you could do some inference over the schema. We also have tools that let you query the model directly. So I can say, give me all the classes in my model, give me all the slots in my model, show me all the ancestors of all my classes in this model, and there's tools to do that. So just to give a little overview of the landscape of the tools I was talking about, I mean, I guess you kind of say that authoring LinkML in YAML is still kind of geeky. It might not be the most obvious to every user of our modeling language how to write models in YAML, but I'll talk about some other ways to author LinkML in a few slides. But so say you have this LinkML YAML file that describes your model, then you can compile it down to other frameworks and serializations. We have all sorts right now, and it feels like there's more coming out every day. Keeping up with Chris is always a fun challenge, but he's done an amazing amount of work on serializing this model in OWL, Shackle, Shex, JSON-LD, Protobuf, JSON schema. There are Python and Java class serializations of any LinkML model, SQL, DDL, and even TSVs. And so what our method here is that you should really choose the right tool for the job. We don't say that you must use JSON schema to do ingest. You could do that in TSVs as long as your model is the source of truth, right? And you might be able to fit in this LinkML model into an existing or traditional application or framework or infrastructure. So as an example, the Alliance of Genome Resources that I was sort of introducing before, they had written a handcrafted JSON schema, handwritten JSON schema to handle all of their ETL processes, all of their ingest into the Alliance. And what we've done over the course of the last, several meetings is transfer that JSON schema into LinkML, and now we're generating the JSON schema that we need from LinkML instead of handcrafting it. And that helps too, because in the Alliance, you might have this ingest pipeline that's dependent on JSON schema, but you also have 2 Postgres databases that are dependent on the model being represented in SQL. So you can kind of actually keep this continuum of a single source of truth, a single model throughout your technical architecture, which is kind of a nice feature of this software stack. So the first step is to create your data model. Like I said, you can kind of author YAML directly. There are a ton of examples out there already of LinkML models, and especially in the LinkML repository, there are basic examples where you don't need to know a lot about the domain particularly. This one, it gives you an example about persons and how you'd model them. At the top, there's some metadata about your model itself. It talks a little bit about how you would maintain the prefixes of the queries. Remember, this is sort of based in semantic web technology, so we're sort of committed when we need to be about identifying objects uniquely across the web and persistently. And then you can import different LinkML models into your model. So in this case, and in most LinkML models, you can import the basic types from the LinkML meta model itself. But I'll show you some use cases where you can import different models. So I could import an Alliance model into my Monarch model, for example, if I needed to, which is a nice way to reuse models between organizations. But authoring YAML isn't the only way to do it. And I invited Mark, he's another member of our group, to come because he's been doing a lot of work with this tool we have named called Schema Sheets. Hi, Mark. And Schema Sheets is a way to author LinkML models using an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Sheet. There is sort of like a syntax to follow in the header of that schema sheet, and then you can kind of just specify your entire model in a Google Doc or a Google Sheet, without having to worry about YAML so much. And I think this is really good for those kinds of models that have that are very wide, have a lot of attributes, but not a lot of class hierarchy. So that's one use case we found it very useful for as well. You can also do, there's other ways to create your model. I actually will show you a little bit later on. I took your really nice VRS JSON file, JSON schema, and the versatile JSON schema. And I know Matt Brush has been working on the VA JSON schema. And I ran him through this tool called Auto Schema that's provided from LinkML, which takes things that are well structured like JSON schemas and translates them into LinkML. I just did it as an experiment to sort of test the tool and make sure it was doing what we expect, but it actually turned out pretty well. It was sort of almost push button to get a JSON schema into LinkML. I'm sure if you looked at it, there would probably be some hand editing to do, but it worked very nicely. So there's lots of different ways to submit your data, to generate your data model, but there's also tooling for submitting data that is compliant with a model. You can, one of the major tools that we're working on is a partnership with Damon Dooley's group called working on a project called the Data Harmonizer. And what the Data Harmonizer does is it takes a schema and it implements that in sort of like a table-based editing interface. And we have hooks for LinkML so that you can take a LinkML schema and represent it in Data Harmonizer. So it's such that you have a very simple curation interface here that is validating on the fly for you the data entry you're doing. So if you had a LinkML schema that defined sample storage temperature as being, it needed to be a number with a unit, and you tried to enter a number without a unit. I'm just assuming this is how it works. I don't use it very often, but then it would show you as a red or a failed attempt at entering that row of data. So, it's expensive to create UIs for submitting things. If you can have a model that is immediately reflected in a simple data submission tool, that's kind of a big bonus. You can also, like I was saying before, integrate different serializations of the model into your existing pipelines. This is the example that I was talking about with Alliance, where we introduced a JSON schema a long time ago. We rewrote that in LinkML, and now we're able to just sort of plug in the generated JSON schema into our existing pipeline and use our JSON schema validator. We don't actually have to use a validator from LinkML. We just use a very common generic JSON schema validator to make sure that those ingests work correctly. And so another benefit of LinkML that I think is kind of underappreciated is the fact that it can generate documentation for your schema sort of out of the box, by default and out of the box. And it's extremely important, as we were talking about earlier, for data integrators to understand how your model is represented and what you mean by the terms that you're using to represent your data structures. And in fact, it's even more important when you see a download file to understand what those columns mean and how they relate to each other. I can't tell you how many download files, for example, I've used, or how many APIs that I've used where I'm not sure if I can, pick and choose the columns or pick and choose the attributes that I think are important versus the ones that are provided with a particular endpoint or a particular Excel file, because oftentimes what I'm looking for isn't exactly the same as what someone else has provided me. So this kind of documentation really gives you a place to look, and it gives you a place to start with understanding how another group has represented their mental model of the data. And further to the point, another kind of modeling roadblock that we've run into in the course of the projects I've worked on is that oftentimes you have a subject matter expert and a developer trying to work together to represent this data. And the subject matter expert has years and years of understanding of the biology of what they're speaking about. And the developer might have years and years of experience representing data in technical data structures. And the two of them oftentimes communicate through presentations or Google Docs. And the cool thing about LinkML is that both of your subject matter experts and developers, and I'm being very dramatic about this. Oftentimes people work in the middle, don't get me wrong. But the thing about LinkML is that you can provide descriptions about your data classes that live with the model itself. So it's very close to what you're working on at the time. And those descriptions can come from both developers and subject matter experts, right? It's a democratization. It's leveling the playing field is what I'm trying to say, and letting people communicate in one simple language with each other. And that really speeds up the process of going from a data source to a user interface through many layers of expertise. And I just wanted to show you that the documentation it generates here in LinkML isn't necessarily wedded to read the docs, which is this format. You can kind of customize that to your needs. This is a model from the Cancer Data Harmonization Project, CRDC, and they chose to use the material theme for their docs. And you can, customize whether or not you see a class description in a hierarchy here, or, how the sidebar looks. You can really do a lot with that. You can even kind of start, this is the NMDC schema. This is the National Microbiome Data Collaborative. And they chose, read the docs as their theme for their docs. And they can also sort of, you can see a class diagram here for them, and that's configurable with LinkML as well. So you can have your own handwritten docs here associated with the auto-generated docs. And this is all, all of this class diagrams and, hierarchies auto-generated from LinkML and from the descriptions and the class hierarchy you put in the model itself. So, I sort of mentioned briefly that, ontologies were born at the same time as the Semantic Web, and we're really committed to incorporating ontologies into standards because for a variety of reasons. but there's several hooks into the LinkML modeling framework that allow you to incorporate these ontologies into your standards. One of those ways is through value sets. Let me just show you first, though, how you would do it in your basic model. So this, again, is a LinkML model of person. We've kind of been seeing it the whole time, and there's various ways to incorporate external vocabularies into your model. I'll talk about class URI and slot URI. These are two fields that allow you to refer to a query or a short form of a URI directly in your model. So a class URI, one second. So the class URI here in this model is saying that this person object is exactly the definition of person at the schema.org location. So it's saying the definition of person at schema.org is exactly equivalent to my definition of person in my model. And this is really helpful because then it allows people that are experts on domains of biology to maintain and write the descriptions for objects externally to your project. I mean, I don't need to define what a person is. Schema.org has done a very nice job of defining that for me, but I do want to use person in my model. So I'm going to go ahead and say that my person is equivalent to theirs. So I've let them handle what person means. And, that's extremely important when you're writing a really big model. You want to kind of say, if I have the definition of gene in my model, I want the sequence ontology definition of gene. I'm going to go ahead and put the class URI to be the sequence ontology version of that identifier. Same thing with slots. You can use slots from different or attributes, columns, etc., from external sources. And another way you can do this in LinkML is you can have these like value sets or enumerations in your model. So if I want to make a small controlled vocabulary of terms that are valid entry points for my let's see, my morphology slot or my morphology attribute, I could define those permissible values in an enumeration. So my user might be able to say nanotube in their user interface, but what I really mean under the covers of nanotube is the KEBI definition of nanotube. And so that's sort of built right into LinkML as well. Which is a very nice way to bring those ontologies back into a bigger schema definition. And LinkML has a lot of other nice schema features that I use all the time. One of them is inheritance or polymorphism. This is an example from the Alliance of Genome Resources schema. Here's a gene object. It has a description that fits with the Alliance definition of gene. I'm going to say that it is a biological entity. Biological entity is another class in my model. And it also has all of these mix-ins, which are the polymorphic or alternate parents of a gene. So this is kind of handling the biochemistry divide. Oh, apologies. So you can say that a gene is an entity in biology and it has this representation, but it's also a nucleic acid entity. Maybe that's not exactly right, but nucleic acid entity in chemistry. So you kind of use that as a polymorphic inheritance. We also have mappings in LinkML. So these mappings allow us to say, this gene is exactly, we've talked about class URIs. This is another way to do it in LinkML to bring in those ontologies. You can say that this gene is exactly mapped to this SO term. I imagine that SO term is the SO term for gene. We also have the construct of identifier prefixes. So in this way, there's been tooling written in the NCATS data translator project that takes the ID prefixes listed in a LinkML model and says, okay, this is an ordered list of what we assume identifies a gene in our architecture. So in NCATS, the top level or most preferred identifier for a gene is an NCBI gene identifier. And then the second most desirable gene for identifier for a gene is an ensemble gene ID and then an HGNC ID. And you can sort of like customize the order of preference of your identifiers, but there's a tool that we've developed from this model where you can say, I'm going to give the tool two identifiers, NCBI gene and ensemble. It's going to look at the hierarchy in the model and provide back the appropriate identifier. So it kind of gets to the root of that problem where you're saying this resource uses NCBI gene, this resource uses HGNC. I want to define a way in my model to say, bring me back NCBI gene IDs instead of HGNC IDs so that I can query across many different data sources with the same identifier. So it's a small thing, but it's very, very helpful. We also have the ability to declare complex conditional constraints. So this is an example of an expression experiment class from, I think it's from Alliance as well, where we've just defined these rules that say, sort of like the any of construct in JSON schema, where we say, okay, well, for an expression experiment, I must have at least the biological entity assayed or the reagents used. So I need to have, I believe this is a probe or a gene, right? One of those two things must be true in order to have a valid expression experiment object. We also have the ability to establish an identifier for a particular class and also unique constraints. So in this case, I'm saying that the query, the slot query that they've defined to represent the identifier of a sequence targeting reagent must be unique. Identifier is equal to true. You can also specify, I don't have an example here, but a list of slots or attributes of your class that uniquely define that class. And so that's sort of really important if you're trying to convert your model into some sort of like relational diagram or relational model. You want to have your unique constraints thought about before you kind of like establish a user entry mechanism to your database. And just, you know, all of this is really important because it gives people a conversation starting point, you know, really within an organization and outside of your organization. If you have a model that declares all this in one spot, it's a great conversation starter between technologists and curators, or technologists and subject matter experts, also between external parties and your resource. You really have a way to speak the same language and also discuss things that might not make sense as you go. So coming back around to our original use cases, the NCATS data translator project, started about 3 years ago. They found that they had these 300 resources that have all different kinds of specifications for their data structures. We implemented a LinkML model called BioLink. It's kind of the flagship LinkML model that sponsored the development of LinkML as well. It has been reused in a variety of different projects. All of these different knowledge sources, all of these 300 plus resources convert their knowledge into a representation that is tagged with BioLink model classes and slots. So we can ask these questions in a federated way across all of these different knowledge sources because everyone's communicating BioLink back to the questioner or back to the knowledge source. And sort of on a tangent, BioLink model is also used for a variety of different knowledge graph sources, including Monarch and some offshoots of that as well. And one of the nice parts about LinkML is that you can serialize, as I've talked about, your model in a variety of different formats. So BioLink model is actually serialized into OWL. And if you go to BioPortal and you're comfortable looking at ontologies, you can actually browse BioLink model as an ontology in BioPortal. You can do that with any LinkML model. And going back to the use case of Alliance that I've been talking about a lot, here's their version of the documentation that was sort of auto-generated. They've customized their class diagrams here a little bit differently. As I was mentioning, they have an ingest pipeline now that uses the converted form of their LinkML schema in a JSON validation way. They also have 2 different Postgres databases that both use LinkML, the same LinkML model, to represent their tables and keys. And between the 2, they have an API that speaks JSON, and that JSON is reflective of some of the model as well. So we actually have 2 places where the model is being used, and 2 different Scrum teams actually that are using 2 different databases with the same model underneath. And you can do, you don't have to just use it for a particular architecture. You can convert other existing formats into LinkML. This is kind of a repository that Chris started where he took the very familiar GFF specification and translated it into LinkML. We also have GPAD and GAF, which are gene ontology, very common gene ontology file formats that are translated into LinkML. I took some time and converted the Obo Foundry's JSON format into a LinkML of OBO graph models. And I did, like I was mentioning earlier, I did a little bit of an experiment where I took your, JSON schemas and converted them into LinkML and generated some documentation sites for those models as well. And my colleague Sujai has been working with Matt Brush on the VA representation of your models in LinkML as well. And Matt and Sujai have been working hard to customize the documentation on this just an experimental instance of the VA spec to reflect what's important. I think they're adding things like example data to the class page, which is really nice. I think that'll make its way back up into LinkML. We're very interested in contributions. So if there's use cases that we can't support, we're always willing to take those back into the main LinkML repository so we can share it with other people. And just, briefly, there's, plenty of other people that are sort of adopting LinkML. I didn't talk much about the National Microbiome Data Collaborative. Mark, my colleague that's here today, works heavily on NMDC. They use LinkML for their model. We have the GSC. Mark also works on that, I believe. That's making strides towards modeling things like MixS in LinkML, I believe. Monarch Initiative, our colleague Deepak Uni works for the German Human Genome Phenome Archive, and they're using LinkML. So there's a lot of people that are picking it up, which is nice. It's growing every day. Right now, we're driven by community contributions, so we definitely welcome pull requests and issues and all sorts of things. Anything if you're using LinkML and you find something wrong, please just reach out. We do have some future plans. We want to make some more documentation and tutorials. There is a tutorial out there, which I'll point you to at the end. But we want to, harden that and make it easier for people to use LinkML. We want to increase our efficiency of our data readers and writers. So we want to make it really quick to load in a TSV file and spit out the JSON, JSON equivalent. And we also are, sort of dreaming of a web-based interface for some of this as well. So even though we can have LinkML models authored in a Google spreadsheet, we want to make it even easier for people to do that on the web. So just in summary, authoring standards and data models is hard, as we all know very well. Adding those semantics is sometimes tricky, and developing tools like UI and validators is sometimes expensive. LinkML is supposed to be easy to use. It's designed that way. You sort of add semantics as you need them, and with clear instructions on how to do that, you can leverage or parasitize multiple tool stacks like JSON schema validation, SQL, loaders and dumpers, et cetera, to make what you need work. And it's really being adopted more quickly lately. And there's plenty of people that work on this project. Chris and Harold were the driving forces here, but a whole lot of people work on it. And we're anxious to hear your feedback and fix it up the way you'd like it as well. So please reach out and let us know how we can help. And that's it.
Well, thank you for a fantastic presentation and overview of the LinkML language. I have a few questions of my own. I'll lead off with one while people are thinking of their own questions they'd like to ask. One of the big challenges with, kind of a meta model like this, where you're trying to define things that can be exported to a lot of different, downstream frameworks, is the kind of the nuances and challenges between and differences between the way that those various frameworks think about data representation, how they model it, things like that. I imagine that there's probably some, of course there is some standardized tooling you guys have built to kind of take a LinkML model and transform it into these various downstream artifacts. But as people are trying to use those artifacts, they determine there are subtle changes that need to be made. What's the LinkML strategy for kind of maintaining those changes in an automated way, right? So if you determine a particular slot needs to be kind of put in a different place in a downstream JSON schema artifact, for example, rather than what the default tooling does, how's that handled in LinkML?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. oftentimes, LinkML is extremely expressive. Let me see if I can find the, it's an extremely expressive framework. And oftentimes when you're compiling to other frameworks, you're going to lose some of that expressivity. Sometimes these transforms are going to be a little bit lossy, and that's just a matter of some forms are much better at representing something in their form, some specific modeling or language component in their form than they are in something else. So for example, in SQL DDL, you're not going to be able to write a description for every column. That just doesn't exist, right? But you can do that in your LinkML model. So, I mean, to answer your question, I think your question, maybe I'm interpreting it with two parts. Like, how do you, customize LinkML for a particular use case that really wants to use the JSON schema serialization? Well, we just do, right? We add components to the model to make LinkML more expressive, where you might not be able to translate that very specific JSON schema thing into SQL, but for the JSON schema generator, it's going to work better. And so most recently, I think we added the support for any of and one of. Those weren't original, model components in LinkML, but we saw in JSON schema how well they were being used. So we added that back into the LinkML specification. That, of course, isn't going to translate into some other schema situation, other schema serializations. But we also, meet weekly. I guess those are sort of the pragmatic ways that we handle requests coming back in. We meet weekly. We have an active GitHub issue tracker, and we are use case based. So we try to bring back those use cases into the model when we can. Mark, did you want to take a stab at answering that question or have anything else to add?
No, I think you would address that very well. I only use a few of the derivatives, and I've never felt like I was encumbered by the derived artifacts.
Okay,
I think Sierra, maybe she's asking me because I unfortunately have to leave in a couple of minutes.
No problem.
You're in good hands with Sierra.
Maybe I'll check the chat. Okay, good. Never mind.
So I see James, you turned on your video. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So I don't know if this is like maybe too in the weeds, but this was the example I thought of. So say you are trying to generate data in a form that is like maybe more granular or whatever than the sort of more abstract LinkML. So, and maybe LinkML already contains this, but in Java, the difference between like a short and an int, is there sort of way to customize the generation that you can like force an attribute to get more granular, or is the idea that you would kind of post-process it manually yourself with a script or something?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like I think you're getting at the heart of that sort of brief discussion I had about the overlap between subject matter expertise and technical expertise, where, a technologist might say, I really need a short, and what you've provided me is an int or whatever it is. And I can't work that out. Like, how do I manage this? And, I really feel like the idea with LinkML is that you would take that and be empowered to say, I need a type of short. And we would make that as in the standard, and your modeling friends would add that to the standard as well. There should be this, maybe this is Pollyanna. And believe me, I've worked on plenty of projects where I've had to translate technically the model that was developed into something that's actually usable downstream. But, the idea really is to put that back into the model so that you're educating, the subject matter experts on what you actually need to implement something. You're educating developers on the subject matter, right? So the idea would be to increase the coverage of types in LinkML and be able to use that as your type, specifically in the model. To be fair, some of the projects I've worked on, in particular, the Alliance is a Java shop, right? And we do generate Java classes from LinkML. When we started this and when Alliance picked up this model framework, the Java classes were sort of unannotated. And what we've developed over time is different kinds of bindings for that Java generator. So we have, I think we just started adding Jackson annotations, or we upgraded our support for Java is it 16 or 17? I can't remember. 17, I think, where you can kind of identify a record level object and reduce all those getters and setters and things in the Java model. So, you have to take it with a grain of salt that LinkML is evolving, and your technical architecture might, have to do some of that manually before it evolves in LinkML, just like any other standard. But the idea would be to translate that back into LinkML and have LinkML generate it for you. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to pick up on where that question left off and ask a little bit about kind of, the downstream stuff that you need to kind of build into your own pipes or your own, project. Specifically, like, imagine that there's a LinkML model for, you mentioned Gene. And maybe there's like a set of attributes associated with Gene that have various requirements regarding uniqueness or required, et cetera. And different downstream implementations may have different ideas about not any sort of argument about what those slots are or their meaning, but rather how required they are, how strict they are, or maybe there are additional imposed restraints that are specific to that application but don't affect the generalized model of what that entity is. Is there a way of like layering LinkML where you've got kind of the base model and then you can kind of say, I am extending the base model with these additional requirements that is, for my particular use case?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And the first thing that comes to mind is to literally do exactly what you said, which is extend your base class in a LinkML specification to be more specific or less specific. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just sort of show my editing interface for LinkML, because I think it will help just show some examples here. So I'm going to open, just to keep on track here with the models we've already talked about. So this is the PyCharm representation of LinkML model for the Alliance of Genome Resources. And you can see that, please ignore all of the directory boilerplate, but in this schema directory, there's all these YAML files that sort of define different components or domains of our Alliance model. And what you can see is, let me just start with the core model, and I can look at, biological entity, for example. This is sort of our main class that is very generic. All we're saying in this object is that it is audited. That's sort of a, it's audited object isn't something that you would find in sort of like the biological definition of a biological entity. It's definitely a technical thing. It's going to say that, I can track who updated this. Any object that descends from biological entity, I can track who updated it. And it has a couple of slots, right? It has query and taxon. And you'll notice that query slot is not required, right? Because in a biological entity, you might have some children of that class that don't actually require an identifier. And it's sort of a weird thing to say, but it's possible. And then if you kind of go down towards, let's see, I can't remember if Gene is in this class. Yeah, so if you go down towards Gene, it sort of inherits from biological entity. Just trust me, genomic entity is part of biological entity. It's part of the hierarchy. But what you can see is down here in this modeling element called slot usage, you can kind of make more specific demands of the gene object than you can of biological entities. So in this case, we've added a slot called symbol to that biological entity, and we've made it required, right? So a gene must have a symbol. So it's a very simple answer to your question. You can make objects that descend from one another more specific in LinkML. I don't think it necessarily answers your question about technical stacks that have downstream requirements that are different than the upstream requirements. I mean, I can almost see like having two LinkML models potentially. If you have some sort of API restriction, for example, you might want to model that API differently than your main model, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I need some more details about that.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate the explanation. All right, are there any other questions for Sierra?
Just check the chat. Okay, good.
All right, well, hearing none, thank you very much for your time and your presentation today. It was delightful. We'll go ahead and, of course, share your contact information if anyone has any follow-up questions. And then thanks again for your time, and we'll see everyone again at the next VICC call in 2 weeks, I think. Maybe 3 if there's 5 weeks this month. All right. Thanks all.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.